Long before Bram Stoker created the famous story of Dracula, Ireland already had its own tale of a blood-drinking creature who refused to stay in the grave. This figure was known as the Abhartach, a local ruler whose story has been passed down for centuries. The legend is one of the earliest vampire-like stories in Europe, and it shows that people in Ireland were already imagining the dead rising to drink blood long before such ideas became popular in literature. But the big question is whether this was a real event, based on a real person, or whether it is simply a myth created to explain fear, death, and mystery. The Abhartach is said to have been a chieftain, which means he was the leader of a small kingdom in early Ireland. At that time, Ireland was not ruled by a single king, but by many small rulers, each controlling a limited area of land and people. Some of these rulers were fair and just, while others were remembered as harsh and cruel. The Abhartach belonged to the second type. According to the story, he was a tyrant who ruled with cruelty, making his people suffer under his power. His name, Abhartach, is often thought to mean dwarf or small man, and many versions of the tale describe him as being short in stature or even deformed. His small size, however, did not reduce the fear he created. People whispered about him, not only because of his cruelty, but because there was something strange and unsettling about him. Eventually, the people could no longer bear his rule. Some say his own subjects turned against him, while others say that a neighboring chieftain named Cathan rose up and killed him. Either way, the Abhartach was finally defeated, and his people believed they were free from his tyranny. He was buried, as was the custom, and life seemed to return to normal. But this was only the beginning of the strange events that gave birth to the legend. Not long after he was buried, the Abhartach rose again. To the horror of the people, he returned from the grave, not as an ordinary man, but as something dark and unnatural. He demanded a tribute from his people, but it was not the tribute of gold, food, or land that a normal ruler would have asked for. Instead, he demanded blood. The Abhartach drank the blood of the living, taking their life force to sustain himself. His people realized that their old tyrant had become something monstrous. He was no longer just a cruel man, but an undead creature who could not be controlled by ordinary means. The people tried to fight back. They killed him again, hoping this time he would stay dead. His body was buried once more. But the peace did not last. Again he rose from the grave, once more seeking blood from the living. A third time they killed him, and again he returned. The cycle of death and return seemed impossible to break. Each time they thought they were rid of him, he came back, leaving the people more terrified than before. It seemed that nothing could stop their former ruler from continuing to torment them even after death. Finally, the community sought help. They turned to someone with greater knowledge. Some stories say it was a Christian saint, while others say it was a druid or a wise man. This figure explained that the Abhartach was one of the walking dead, known in Irish as the Neam Merb. Ordinary weapons and ordinary burials would never hold him. To stop him, they would have to follow ancient and unusual rituals designed specifically to trap creatures of the undead. The advice was very clear. The Abhartach could not be killed with normal iron weapons. Instead, he had to be slain with a sword made of yew wood. The yew tree had long been associated with death and graveyards in Celtic tradition, so its wood carried special symbolic power. After killing him with the yew sword, his body had to be buried upside down, with his head pointing downward, to confuse his spirit and trap him in the earth. Heavy stones would need to be placed over the grave to hold him there, preventing him from rising again. In some versions of the story, protective plants such as thorns were also planted over the grave as an extra barrier against his escape. The people followed these instructions, and at last, the Abhartach was defeated. Buried upside down, pinned under stones, and sealed with protective rituals, he could no longer rise from the grave. His terror finally ended, though the memory of him never did. The site of his grave is still said to exist today in Slot Abhartach, County Derry, where a place known as the Giant's Grave, or Leached Abhartach, is linked to the legend. For centuries, people in the area treated the site with respect, fearing the power of the story and what might happen if the grave were disturbed. This legend is important because it is one of the first stories in Europe to describe a vampire-like figure. Most people today think of vampires as creatures from Eastern European folklore, but the Abhartach shows that Ireland already had its own version of the undead who fed on blood. In fact, it may be one of the oldest vampire legends recorded. This suggests that the fear of the dead rising from the grave and preying on the living was not unique to one culture, but was a common human fear that appeared in many different places. The Abhartach story also reveals much about Irish beliefs in the past. Death was not always seen as final. People feared that the dead might return, especially if they had been evil or unsettled in life. At the same time, the legend shows how important rituals and traditions were in dealing with death. It was not enough to bury a cruel man. Special steps had to be taken to keep him down. This reflected a deep concern with the boundary between life and death, and the fear of what might happen if that boundary were broken. But was the Abhartach real? This question has fascinated many historians and storytellers. On one hand, it is possible that there was indeed a local chieftain named Abhartach who ruled cruelly in the Derry area. Many legends begin with real people whose stories are later exaggerated. If he was short in stature, unusual in appearance, and harsh in his rule, it would not be surprising if his memory turned into something larger than life. His people might have feared him so much that even after his death, they imagined he had returned to trouble them. Over time, these fears could have grown into the story of a blood-drinking tyrant who rose from the grave. On the other hand, the supernatural parts of the story are almost certainly myth. There is no evidence that anyone ever rose from the dead to drink blood. Instead, these details likely came from the human need to explain the unknown. In the past, when people did not understand disease or sudden death, they often blamed supernatural forces. If a community was struck by illness after the death of a cruel ruler, people might have believed that he was feeding on them from beyond the grave. The idea of blood loss, weakness, and wasting away could easily be linked to the image of a vampire-like creature. Thus, the myth of the Abhartach may have been a way of making sense of mysterious events in a time without modern science. The story also lasted because it was powerful. It combined the fear of tyranny with the fear of death. A cruel ruler was already a figure of terror, but the idea of him returning from the grave made him even more frightening. This gave the story great strength, allowing it to survive for centuries. Even today, the Abhartach continues to be told, not only as folklore, but as an early example of the vampire myth that has become so popular in modern culture. Some even believe that Bram Stoker, who was Irish, might have known about the Abhartach legend when he wrote Dracula. Although Dracula is mostly based on Eastern European folklore and on the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, it is possible that Stoker was influenced by vampire-like tales from his own country. In the end, the Abhartach is best understood as a legend rather than a historical event. There may have been a real man behind the story, but the blood-drinking undead ruler belongs to the world of myth. The legend shows how human imagination works, taking real fears and real people and turning them into something larger, darker, and more powerful. The Abhartach was not the world's first emperor, nor was he truly a vampire, but he was one of the first characters in history to embody the idea of a blood-drinking creature who could not be kept in the grave. The legend also teaches us something about human nature. People everywhere have always struggled with fear of death and the unknown. Stories like the Abhartach give shape to those fears, making them into something that can be fought, defeated, and controlled, even if only in imagination. The rituals described in the story, the yew sword, the upside-down burial, the heavy stones, are not just magical tricks. They are ways of showing that even the most frightening forces can be contained if people know the right steps to take. In this way, the legend gave comfort as well as fear. To put it simply, the Abhartach story is not a true historical incident, but a piece of Irish folklore. It may have begun with the memory of a cruel ruler, but it grew into a myth about the undead, reflecting the fears and beliefs of early Ireland. It is one of the oldest vampire stories we know, and it connects Ireland's past with the wider tradition of vampire myths across the world. Whether real or myth, the Abhartach has earned his place in history as one of the most fascinating figures in folklore, a reminder of how thin the line can be between memory, story, and legend.